liftoff on Apollo 11.
Then it really hit me. I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all.
Charles Duke is one of 4 people still alive who walked on the moon. And for 50 years he said what NASA told him to say and kept the real story locked somewhere. But what he is about to reveal now, NASA missed it. The photos don't show it. The mission reports don't mention it. And the men who could have corroborated it are either dead or still silent. Charles Duke is not silent anymore. What he saw on the moon was not supposed to be there. It will change everything you thought about life, death, and what's beyond. The voice that knew too much. When people think about the moon landing, they picture Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and a grainy black and white broadcast watched by millions. What they don't picture is the man sitting in a sealed room in Houston with sweat collecting under a headset, knowing that if he chose the wrong words, history could unravel in real time. In July 1969, the Cold War still shaped every major decision the United States made. Apollo was not sent to the moon only for science or discovery. It was sent to prove American strength, control, and reliability under extreme pressure. Failure would not have been remembered as a technical mistake. It would have been seen as a global humiliation. Inside Mission Control, that pressure rested heavily on one position: Capcom, the capsule communicator. Capcom was the only person allowed to speak directly to the astronauts in space. Every instruction, warning, and correction passed through that single voice. That voice belonged to Charles Duke. At just 33 years old, Duke was young, calm, and already an astronaut himself. He was chosen because astronauts trusted someone who understood exactly what could go wrong. He was there to keep 3 men alive while the entire world watched. When Neil Armstrong finally said the words that would echo through history, "The Eagle has landed," he was confirming that the lunar module, named Eagle, had reached the moon's surface and that the crew was still alive. Inside Mission Control, the room exploded with applause, relief, and exhausted smiles. What the public heard that day was reassurance. But what Duke felt was something else entirely, because the landing wasn't clean. The fuel margins were nearly gone and the guidance alarms had gone off mid-descent. Even the systems were being pushed past the edge of simulation. The lunar module had landed, yes, but it had landed wounded. This information was kept away from the public. Then everyone in that room knew that landing was only half the problem. The astronauts still had to leave. Through his headset, Duke heard more than the public broadcast. He listened to telemetry streams and a side-channel chatter. That was when he started noticing odd things. There were tiny fluctuations in readings that didn't match what training manuals promised. It was nothing dramatic enough to trigger an abort or catastrophic enough to justify panic, but it was enough to make experienced engineers exchange looks instead of words, and enough to be kept away from public reports. Instead of focusing on this little risk, Mission Control used humor as a survival tool. Engineers cracked jokes to keep hands steady and voices level. Of all of them, Duke understood the real stakes. One misread sensor, one assumption carried too far and overlooked anomaly, and the first moon landing wouldn't be remembered as a triumph it was. Instead, it would be remembered as a live, irreversible failure. And that's why Duke's voice mattered. He wasn't there to speculate or react emotionally. He was the last filter between raw uncertainty and controlled response. Now, looking back more than 50 years later, he confesses that every sentence he spoke had to be weighed, stripped of doubt, and delivered with just enough calm to keep 3 men focused inside a machine, away from pancaking. It was there between Earth and the void that Duke learned something most people never do. The moon wasn't waiting for humanity. And most of all, it wasn't what we thought it was. The moon didn't care about our science, politics, or beliefs. It was an environment that had its rules. Yet NASA was trying to bend the moon to their own rules. And that realization didn't fade when Apollo 11 ended safely. It stayed with him because 3 years later, Charles Duke wouldn't be sitting behind a console and filtering his words through a microphone. He would be standing on the surface of the moon himself, sealed inside a suit, face to face with the place that had already proven it was more than we thought. And that's when he saw things so shocking that it took him getting close to the grave to finally confess. The lunar void. In April 1972, Charles Duke finally arrived at the place he had spent years talking to from a safe distance. Apollo 16 was not meant to be dramatic, as it was a working mission. Duke and Commander John Young were sent to the Descartes Highlands to settle the technical argument of whether the region had been shaped by ancient volcanoes or by something far more violent. Thus, the goal was data, not discovery. But the moment Duke climbed down the ladder and put his boot on the surface, the mission stopped feeling like science and started feeling like exposure. The first thing that struck him was not beauty. It was how wrong everything felt. The moon did not resemble the images he had seen for years in training rooms and briefing slides. There was no soft glow or gentle stillness. Above him was a black sky that did not fade or blur at the edges. It was absolute. Duke later said it felt less like standing outdoors and more like standing inside a sealed container with the lights turned off. The sunlight made things worse. On Earth, light spreads, bounces, and softens edges. On the moon, it did none of that. Sunlight hit the ground like a spotlight and stopped. One step could place his boots in blinding brightness while his shadow fell into complete darkness. There was no middle ground, and objects didn't gradually come into view. They appeared suddenly, sharply, and without warning. Depth perception became unreliable almost immediately. Earth should have been comforting. It should have been there, hanging in the sky like a reminder of home. But from Duke's position, it wasn't. The planet sat almost directly overhead, blocked by his helmet and his own body. For long stretches of time, Earth simply did not exist in his field of view. There was no horizon to orient himself or familiar reference point. It was just ground sky and the slow confirmation that he was completely cut off. Movement required constant attention. Walking was not natural. Turning was not instinctive. Every action had to be thought through before it happened. The moon punished assumptions. Distances looked shorter than they were. Slopes appeared flatter than they felt underfoot. Shadows hid depressions that could twist an ankle or send a man falling. Duke quickly learned that instincts trained on Earth could not be trusted here. As the minutes passed, his awareness narrowed. He began noticing details he hadn't expected to matter. The way shadows clung to the ground longer than he thought they should, and the way objects seemed to change shape as he moved. Not because they were moving, but because the light made them appear different from every angle. Nothing was intuitive, and everything had to be checked, rechecked, and then checked again. This wasn't fear in the traditional sense, as Duke wasn't panicking but alert. He had spent years believing that training could prepare a human for anything. Yet standing there sealed inside his suit, he realized training only worked until the environment stopped cooperating. Still, he had a focus here, and it was to unearth the moon's violent past. Unearthing the moon's violent past. By the time Duke stepped on the moon, NASA already knew how to land on flat ground. The earlier missions had chosen wide, smooth plains because they were safer. But safety doesn't answer questions. The Descartes Highlands were chosen precisely because they were dangerous. Scientists believed the region might be volcanic, which was proof that the moon once had internal heat and activity. If that theory was correct, it would rewrite how the moon formed. Duke and John Young were sent there to settle that argument on the ground, not from orbit. The terrain immediately made it clear why no one had gone there before. The surface was broken, uneven, and sharp. Rocks jutted out at odd angles. Craters overlapped each other in ways that erased clear boundaries. There were no natural paths, no smooth stretches that invited confidence. Every step required judgment, and one wrong move could tear a suit or slam a man into the ground with no way to recover. As they began collecting samples, The story the moon was telling started to contradict expectations. First off, the rocks didn't even look volcanic. They weren't smooth or layered the way lava flows should be. Instead, they were fractured and chaotic. Many of them were breccias, which were pieces of different rocks smashed together and fused by intense pressure. That kind of formation doesn't come from slow internal processes. It comes from impact, force, and collision. The implication was unsettling. This was proof that the highlands weren't shaped by gentle geology. They were evidence that the moon had been hit, again and again, by massive objects over billions of years. There was no atmosphere to burn incoming debris or weather to erase the damage. Every impact stayed, and every wound remained visible. The moon wasn't a quiet place frozen in time, but a record of sustained violence. Duke remembered that moving through that landscape made the danger impossible to ignore. The low gravity made falls easier, but it didn't make them safer. A slip into a shallow crater could send a man tumbling in slow motion, unable to correct himself. A sharp edge could puncture fabric that was never designed to meet raw stone. There was no emergency response backup suit, no second chance. If something went wrong, it would end there, with no one able to intervene. Some of the samples raised questions that didn't have immediate answers. Certain crystalline structures didn't fit neatly into existing models, and mineral patterns appeared under conditions scientists could describe but not fully replicate. Duke remembered that these weren't headline-grabbing anomalies. They were the kind of details that get flagged, filed, and studied quietly later. Yet, even back then, they added to a growing sense that the moon was less understood than people wanted to admit. Duke followed protocol and labeled, bagged, and documented everything exactly as trained. But standing there, surrounded by shattered terrain, it became clear that the moon was more than met the eye. He wasn't just gathering samples for scientists back home, but was standing inside evidence of a hostile universe. The moon was a place that had survived by enduring impact after impact without protection or warning. The moon hadn't been shaped to support life, but had been shaped by survival. And walking through that terrain, Duke understood something uncomfortable. If the moon had endured that kind of violence for billions of years, then human presence there was not just fragile, but temporary. And that understanding would become painfully personal when one small mistake nearly ended everything. The Moon Olympics near-death incident. Before Apollo 16 ever left Earth, Charles Duke slipped a small photograph into his personal kit. It showed his wife and 2 young sons. NASA allowed astronauts to carry a few personal items, but space was tight, and every object had to justify its weight. Duke chose the photo anyway. On the moon, surrounded by rock and dust that had not changed for billions of years, he placed it gently on the surface. It was a human gesture in an environment that did not care about humans at all. But as the mission progressed, this familiarity bred confidence. Duke and John Young had spent hours moving across the surface, and the suit felt less foreign. The terrain felt more manageable and tasks were nearly complete. With the pressure easing, they began testing movement in low gravity in a half-curious, half-playful behavior. They jokingly referred to it as the Moon Olympics. In 1/6 gravity, the human body behaves differently. Small pushes become leaps, and momentum lingers. Duke decided to jump straight up, just to feel that momentum. So he launched himself nearly 4 feet off the surface. That turned out to be a deadly mistake. Mid-air, the spacesuit backpack shifted. The portable life support system wasn't just equipment. It was his lungs and survival mechanism. When it shifted, his center of gravity moved with it, and Duke had no way to correct himself. No instinct prepared him for falling backward in slow motion, knowing exactly what was about to happen and being unable to stop it. Duke remembered how he hit the ground hard, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. If the life support system had cracked, there would have been no alarm loud enough to save him. There was no emergency procedure and no time for heroic last words. A breach would mean rapid decompression, unconsciousness in seconds, and death shortly after. His body would remain where it fell, preserved by vacuum and cold. That was not a dramatic possibility, but a basic mechanical outcome. Lying on the surface, Duke understood something with brutal clarity: that survival on the moon was not about courage or skill. It all depended on margins, seals holding, and equipment behaving exactly as designed. One uncontrolled movement was enough to erase him. Luckily, Duke got back up and the suit was intact. Systems nominal. Mission Control never heard panic in his voice. Publicly, the incident barely registered. There were no headlines or cautionary films. NASA did not emphasize it, but internally something shifted. Duke stopped moving casually, and every step became deliberate and every turn was planned. He no longer trusted his body to know what to do. Instinct, which kept humans alive on Earth, was unreliable here. After the fall, Duke became more observant, not just of his movements, but of the environment itself. He paid closer attention to shadows, to how the ground played tricks on depth, to how easily perception failed. The sense of control he thought he had gained dissolved. And it was only after that moment, after instinct failed him, that Duke began noticing things he could no longer explain away. These were the things he finally revealed. Now he was close to the end of his life. The things Duke revealed on his deathbed. Charles Duke never framed what he experienced on the moon as a revelation or a discovery. There were no dramatic claims or encounters, yet that restraint is what made his later words unsettling. What stayed with him were small mismatches and details that didn't line up with training, physics, or expectation, and yet were never serious enough to trigger alarms. During Apollo 16, there were long stretches of stillness, the kind where nothing moves unless you move it. In those moments, Duke became aware of something that bothered him enough to remember decades later. Certain shadows were not where he expected them to be. This wasn't casual confusion. The sun's position was tracked constantly, and lighting angles on the moon are predictable because there's no atmosphere to diffuse them. Shadows are sharp, fixed, and brutally consistent. Yet Duke noticed occasions where a shadow appeared displaced, not dramatically shifted, but just wrong. At the time, he blamed fatigue. The suit was exhausting and the environment was disorienting. Yet now, years later, Duke admitted something he had never put in writing. There were moments when shadows were where I hadn't expected them to be. He didn't say they moved or that they changed shape. He said they were already there, in positions that didn't match his memory of the terrain. That distinction mattered to him. As he moved across the highlands, other details drew his attention not from a distance but up close. Certain rock formations seemed less random than they should have been, in the form of repeating angles, layered shapes, and tacked geometries that didn't resemble the chaotic breccias he was collecting. These weren't monoliths, but structures that felt arranged. Duke didn't photograph them as anomalies, as training discouraged interpretation beyond classification. The rocks were logged by type, composition, and context. Anything that didn't fit was mentally filed under erosion, impact mechanics, or human pattern recognition, and he had to follow procedure. But years later, reflecting without checklists or supervisors, Duke admitted something quietly disturbing. If I hadn't been trained to dismiss it immediately, I would have called it constructed, which was supposed to be impossible. That word constructed never appeared in any report. There were also brief flashes and small reflections at the edge of vision. They never lasted long enough to identify a source. Duke checked his visor, other equipment, and the sun's angle against nearby surfaces. Yet nothing explained them. They were logged as environmental optical noise, the kind of thing you don't dwell on when every second outside the lander carries risk. Most of the time, they stayed forgotten. But what unsettled Duke most in later years wasn't any single observation. It was how fast his mind moved away from interpretation. Not because someone ordered him to, but because he had been trained to. Astronauts were conditioned to filter out anything that couldn't be acted upon. Strange but non-threatening observations were distractions. And distractions in space get people killed. So the mind self-corrected. He noticed something didn't fit. Then he stopped noticing. Now, decades later, after NASA, after public life, after the pressure to sound confident and composed had faded, Duke spoke more freely, not publicly or in press conferences, but small conversations and interviews that never made headlines. When asked why none of these observations appeared in official transcripts, his response was careful but revealing. "We didn't lie. We were all taught what not to talk about any strange thing we saw." That distinction mattered to him. They didn't fabricate reports or hide evidence. Instead, they filtered, minimized, and avoided language that opened doors no one knew how to close. An unexplained shadow wasn't a finding, and a strange formation wasn't a conclusion. Without a protocol, it didn't exist. By the time Duke was near the end of his life, he no longer framed these moments as proof of anything. He didn't claim answers, but he no longer dismissed the question either. Something on the moon had challenged his assumptions, and once those words were spoken, the need for explanations became immediate. The explanations that arrived too quickly. When Duke's confession began to surface through interviews, side comments, carefully worded reflections, the response was immediate. Explanations arrived almost before the confession fully formed. Publicly, the first wave came from the usual fringe with claims of alien bases hidden in lunar craters. These were stories about massive structures buried beneath the regolith. The hollow moon theory resurfaced, insisting the moon rang like a bell because it wasn't solid at all. Others pointed to the far side, long out of view, as a convenient hiding place for advanced technology. These ideas were easy to dismiss as they were loud, dramatic, and sloppy. So NASA scientists and affiliated researchers stepped in with calm, technically sound explanations for what Duke had seen on the moon. Shadows, they explained, behave strangely on the moon because the terrain is uneven and the lighting is extreme. With no atmosphere to soften light, small variations in ground height can produce sharp, misleading shadow edges. The sun does move, but not quickly enough over time to alter perception. NASA wasn't exactly wrong. Angular formations, they said, are expected in fractured highland terrain. Breccias break and fuse in chaotic ways. When harsh sunlight hits jagged surfaces at low angles, geometry appears exaggerated. Straight lines emerge where none were intentionally formed. The human brain is wired to impose order, especially in unfamiliar environments. And as for flashes and reflections, those were among the most documented optical issues in lunar missions. Things like visor glare, suit hardware catching light, dust particles drifting into view, and peripheral vision could play tricks under stress and isolation. Astronauts are even warned repeatedly about these effects during training. But yet, something about the response unsettled people who paid close attention. Not the explanations themselves, but the speed and finality with which they were applied. There was no pause or "we don't know yet" or no open-ended investigation into why a veteran astronaut, trained to suppress imagination and focus on data, would remember these moments decades later. The system didn't ask why Duke felt unsettled. It simply categorized his experiences and closed the file. So Duke's observations were neutralized not through censorship, but through explanation. Once an anomaly had a plausible cause, there was no reason to dwell on it or revisit old footage. No reason to ask whether multiple small inconsistencies, taken together, pointed to something unresolved. Anything that could not be tested, measured, or reproduced was treated as irrelevant. Not false, just unnecessary. Duke accepted this for decades and trusted the process. He trusted the men and women who trained him and told himself that discomfort did not equal significance. But explanations, no matter how reasonable, don't erase memory. And as time began running out, Duke stopped trying to control what stayed with him. The final confession. Coming back to Earth did not put Charles Duke back where he started. Gravity returned, noise returned, and so did the crowds. But scale never did. After living in a place where a single mistake meant instant death, everyday problems felt staged. Arguments, deadlines, and ambitions reduced to background noise. Life continued, but it felt misproportioned, as if the world had been zoomed in too far. That disconnect followed him home. His personal life suffered and depression settled in quietly and stayed. Duke didn't talk about it much at the time, but those close to him noticed the change. The moon hadn't traumatized him in a cinematic way. It had recalibrated him. Once you experience a place that does not care whether you live or die, it becomes hard to pretend that everything else operates by familiar rules. Faith came later and gave him structure, boundaries, and language for humility. But faith didn't erase memory and didn't rewrite experience. Yet through all of it, Duke remained loyal to Apollo. That's what made what came later so unsettling. Near the end of his life, Duke didn't introduce new evidence to claim secret knowledge. What changed was how he spoke about what he already knew. His confession wasn't about aliens or machines or hidden cities, but about conditioning. About how astronauts were taught, subtly but thoroughly, to erase anything that didn't fit into the accepted record. On his deathbed, Duke finally said what he had avoided for decades. The moon was not empty in the way people assumed. It existed on terms that human intuition was never designed to grasp. And for the first time, he acknowledged something he had spent a lifetime resisting, that the conspiracy theorists weren't entirely wrong. Not because they had the right answers, but because they were reacting to a real absence in the story. A lot of things about the moon remain unexplained but are never engaged directly. He simply admitted that there were aspects of the moon that resisted classification, and that those aspects had been quietly sidelined because they complicated a narrative that needed to stay clean. Duke never undermined the achievement of Apollo, but he admitted in measured words, "We walked there, we collected samples, we left footprints, but there are corners of that place we never understood. And I'm not sure we ever will. People say it's empty. I've seen enough to know it's not." And his final warning was not aimed at the public, but at the institution that sent him there. The most dangerous thing we brought back from the moon wasn't rocks. It was the belief that we understood what we were standing on. And we didn't want to learn anything that could change what we thought was correct.